All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to get started on the most recent iteration of the Rockefeller College election series. Today's topic is going to be criminal justice policy issues. And so we're joined by three distinguished criminal justice experts from Rockefeller College here. So we're joined by Dr. Shawn Bushway. Dr. Bushway's research focuses on the causal relationship between work and crime, the use of discretion by actors in the criminal justice system, and the process by which individuals desist from crime. We're also joined by Dr. Jason Robey. Dr. Robey's research examines the relationship between declining incarceration rates, race, and inequality, in addition to how social and demographic factors influence crime and criminal justice outcomes. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Robert Worden. Dr. Worden's research focuses on accountability and responsiveness in criminal justice institutions, and as a result, often focuses on studies of policing and police behavior. So before I hand it over to our panelists, just laying out some ground rules. They're all going to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes apiece, roughly. Afterward, we'll hand it over to a Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions over the course of any of our panelists' talk, please just put them in the chat and I will read them to our panelists. Alternatively, you can use the hand raising function and I'll call on you. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Worden.
Okay, thank you, Connor, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being with us, and I'm happy to be with you today. I'm going to focus mainly, if not exclusively, on issues relating to policing and law enforcement. So depending on the nature of your questions, I may have something to offer later. We'll see. I think it's good to bear in mind that the federal government has a fairly limited role in state and local law enforcement, but candidates do offer some clear contrasts, some of symbolic and some of instrumental significance. Let me begin with Donald Trump. Some clues about Donald Trump's policies can be found in his first term. By the same token, whether and to what extent Kamala Harris would hew to the Biden administration's priorities is really not clear, nor would I presume too much based on her policy pronouncements in her previous presidential run 4 to 5 years ago. One form of federal influence on state and local law enforcement is material support. Donald Trump has said that he would approve Justice Department grants only to police departments that adopt stop and frisk policies. He also supports transfers of surplus military equipment to police departments. As president, he rescinded an Obama-era executive order that limited those kinds of transfers. The Biden administration, for its part, has continued the police hiring programs and other support through the COPS office, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, and other programmatic support, such as that through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Kamala Harris says we should, and I'll quote, continue to invest in funding law enforcement, including the hiring and training of officers and people to support them. The administration has also supported community violence intervention, which DOJ describes as, and I'm quoting from DOJ, strategies that engage individuals and groups to prevent and disrupt cycles of violence and retaliation and establish relationships between individuals and community assets to deliver services that save lives, address trauma, provide opportunity, and improve the physical, social, and economic conditions that drive violence. They are rooted in a public health approach like that of cure violence. Evidence on their effectiveness is frankly mixed. Evidence on stop and frisk is also mixed in that it has demonstrable crime prevention effects, but also raises concerns about racial disparity in enforcement and potential detrimental effects on community trust. A second form of potential federal influence is in legislative reforms, such as those proposed to alter qualified immunity for police officers. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that protects government officials from civil lawsuits when they perform their jobs, unless they clearly violate a constitutional right. Donald Trump has said that he would strengthen qualified immunity, though how he would do that has not been specified to my knowledge. In 2020, Kamala Harris supported the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which would have limited qualified immunity, among other things, but to my knowledge, she has not indicated whether she still supports that. A third form of federal influence is the use of authority with which DOJ was endowed in 1994 to investigate patterns or practices of civil rights violations by state and local agencies. Such investigations may lead to litigation or, more likely, the settlement agreements or consent decrees that mandate a series of reforms. They normally include establishing or strengthening citizen oversight mechanisms, establishing or elaborating requirements for reporting use of physical force by police officers, and establishing or strengthening early intervention systems to identify and intervene with officers who engage in patterns of misconduct. I might add, whether such reforms have sustainable impact is an open question. In any case, Donald Trump all but suspended pattern or practice investigations of police departments in his first term, opening only one in Springfield, Massachusetts, which remained open until the Biden administration entered into a consent decree with that city. Donald Trump also overhauled the Voluntary Collaborative Reform Initiative, which practically shut it down. The Collaborative Reform Initiative offered expert technical assistance to agencies that requested it, much in the same way that investigations of pattern or practices of civil rights violations sought to detect areas for potential improvement. The Biden administration revived both pattern or practice investigations by the DOJ Civil Rights Division and the Collaborative Reform Initiative. And with that, I've probably about used my time, and I'm going to turn it over to either Connor or Shawn, one or the other.
Go for it, Shawn. You can go ahead.
Well, I am so glad Rob went first because that was really interesting. What my approach to thinking about this was to first go look into to the extent to which crime is on the minds of voters, particularly swing voters. And the surveys I saw when I did the little bit of research I did onto this suggested that crime was, for the first time in a long time, not a primary concern, either on the civil justice side, civil rights side, in terms of concerns about race and the use of force and things like that, or about safety. It came down, the surveys I saw was like number 8 or 9. And that's a really interesting observation, that we may be in a cycle where that is not a primary topic. I think one place it might be and be kind of hidden a little bit is immigration is a big concern. And oftentimes crime and immigration are sort of tied, incorrectly, in my opinion. The research suggesting that increasing immigration leads to increased crime is simply doesn't exist, in my view. But for the most part, crime is not a big agenda item, and that's an interesting thing to look at. To the extent to which it is, one of the things that's interesting here is the disconnect between perceptions about crime and the actual crime rates and the trends that we observe. And I talked a little bit to Justin Pickett about this ahead of this call, because Justin is an expert on public opinions. He's a professor in criminal justice in Rockefeller College. And up until about 10 years ago, it was largely true that trends and perceptions about crime were followed both by Republicans and Democrats equally. So there may be different perceptions about the levels, but not so much about the direction. In other words, if crime was going up, Democrats and Republicans were both equally likely to see it going up. But that has been disconnected, where it is no longer the case that the trends are perceived the same across the parties. And so, to the extent to which it matters in the election cycle, the perceptions about crime are going to be largely disconnected, even changes in crime, from reality. And that's an interesting and somewhat frustrating phenomenon in the context of criminal justice and crime in 2024, because the reality is crime is substantially reduced from, say, 2000. There was a rise in violent crime in the COVID era, but that has declined. There's been substantial declines. In the most recent data coming out from 2023 is that it has accelerated, and we're getting back to where we were before COVID. At the same time, incarceration rates are dramatically lower. When I say dramatically, I mean dramatically. There's been a 30% reduction in incarceration nationwide. In New York, for example, we've gone from 72,000 people incarcerated in 2000 to 30,000 incarcerated last year. So we're talking dramatic declines. At the same time, there's been dramatic declines in racial disparity. In the federal system, there's pretty good evidence from colleagues of Jason Robey's when he was in graduate school, suggesting that, and Jason probably will speak to this, that the racial disparity in the federal system has not completely been, but been dramatically reduced. And you can also see similar patterns in, for example, school discipline and other areas as well, but generally not recognized. In the context of New York, for example, the racial disparity ratio went from 13 to 8. Nationwide, it went from 8 to 5, and some people say 4. So in terms of what that means is the disproportionality of incarceration for Blacks versus whites. So not to say that it's exactly where we want to be, but there has been dramatic reductions, and the reductions in incarceration have disproportionately benefited Blacks and Hispanics, which is as it should be, given that they were disproportionate in prison to begin with. So there's been a lot of good news on these fronts, but my concern in the current election cycle is that these good news aren't being talked about, aren't being acknowledged. And it's hard to learn from things that you don't even acknowledge are happening. And so, there's always been a bit of a disconnect between reality and perceptions in the context of discussions in the public sphere about crime and criminal justice. I think that disconnect, from what I understand from talking to Justin, has gotten bigger. And in particular, I think it's particularly problematic in this context where there has been dramatic improvements and change within the criminal justice system. I think the criminal justice system deserves some credit for that. But at the same time, it's not being acknowledged, and we can't learn from it. And so I think that's a conundrum confronted by this election. But I don't know if there's any real solution. The good news, I think, is what I started with, which is I don't think crime and criminal justice appear to be among the major topics of concern for this election. So to the extent to which the perceptions don't match reality, it's going to matter less than it might have in other elections. So with that, Connor, hand it over to Jason. Hopefully I teed you up okay, Jason.
Perfect. It was exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Shawn. So I'll just touch relatively briefly on these sort of recent trends in imprisonment. That was one of the things I was planning on talking about, but Shawn already did a great job of overviewing that. But, so as Shawn pointed out, the trends in imprisonment rates have been declining substantially, particularly for Black men and for Black women as well in the last 20 years, accelerated during the COVID pandemic. So one stat that Shawn didn't give you that I'll give you is that we have the lowest prison admission rates in the United States currently that we've had since the 1980s. And so these are really low admission rates by historical standards. And these reductions, importantly, I think have occurred across states throughout the United States and across the political spectrum. So states like Texas have seen substantial reductions, New York, California, Georgia, like any state you want to look at, there have been pretty substantial reductions. And the sort of political motivations for this and the way they've achieved this have varied quite a bit across the states as well. So I really like what Shawn said. It's hard to learn from things you don't acknowledge. And I think that's a key issue here is that, states have been very successful thus far through a relatively bipartisan consensus in reducing prison admission rates. And to the extent that we sort of acknowledge or don't acknowledge that, we might be sort of ignoring or overlooking some of these significant policy changes that have happened that have sort of led to those pretty drastic reductions in the use of imprisonment in the United States. I think there is some growing concern among some scholars and politicians that this bipartisan consensus may be a little bit weaker today, particularly in the context of spikes in homicide during COVID in particular. But I think in general that consensus remains relatively strong across the United States and across the political spectrum. The other main thing I want to talk about, which Shawn also touched on briefly, is this issue of immigration and its connection to both crime and the criminal justice system in particular. So this is one of the most prominent areas of contention in this election, and at least the last two elections, is the issue of immigration. Voters have consistently rated it as one of their most important issues in influencing their decision. And candidates at the federal, state, and local levels have focused a lot of their campaign rhetoric in this election cycle and in previous ones on the topic of immigration. So generally, as a political issue, immigration is not necessarily discussed as a criminal justice issue by the candidates, but there's a really large and growing body of research that has focused on the issue of immigration, which refers to the links between the criminal justice system at various levels and the immigration enforcement systems. Generally, this link is strongest at the federal level, where all immigration crimes are prosecuted, but increasingly the federal government has been relying on state and local criminal justice agencies to enforce federal immigration priorities through programs like Secure Communities, 287G agreements, and the Criminal Alien or Criminal Apprehension Program, also known as CAP. And increasingly, some states like Texas are actually pushing to take over even more of this responsibility from the federal government in trying to enforce immigration. So in part, this election signals how much the federal government will be willing to work with states to enforce immigration laws. Both sides generally are in favor of relatively harsh immigration enforcement, but one side more than the other. So we'll talk about that more in a second. But at the same time, a lot of this is fundamentally beyond the federal government's control. So the state elections also matter tremendously, not only for criminal justice operations writ large, but specifically on this connection between immigration and criminal justice. Just to give one specific policy example of this, the clearest example, I think, is the plan that former President Trump has put forward to have a massive deportation plan that would round up immigrants within the interior of the United States, focusing specifically on those convicted or accused of crimes and undocumented individuals. This is actually not a new idea, but the scale would, of course, be unprecedented. This type of emphasis on deporting immigrants and focusing on those convicted of crimes actually started under the Obama administration primarily. And importantly, the data show that when ICE arrests or deports somebody from the interior of the United States, about 70% of the time they do this through cooperation with local or state criminal justice authorities, most commonly through local jails. So if an incoming Trump administration were to attempt a massive deportation program in this country, they would most likely be relying heavily on local law enforcement to do so, not necessarily on federal law enforcement agencies like ICE. In fact, if you go look at Donald Trump's current website under his sort of issues tab, he specifically states that they would deputize the National Guard and local law enforcement to assist with this mass deportation effort. More generally, there are policies being enacted at the state and local levels that attempt to either strengthen or weaken these ties between the local or state criminal justice systems and the federal immigration enforcement. So Texas has sought to strengthen those ties. States like California have sought to weaken those ties. So again, the state elections matter just as much as the federal elections on this particular issue, I think. And that's where I'll close for now. Thanks.
All right, well, thank you to each of our panelists here. So what we're going to do now is proceed on to audience questions. So if you have any questions in the audience, put them in the chat and I'll read them to our panelists. So we have a couple here. The first is from Joel Harmon. Joel asks, he says, Shawn alluded to a divergence of perceptions across political parties. What is that exactly?
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to greet, there's a bunch of former students on the PhD students, Andrew Davis and Audrey Hickett from CJ, and there may be one other that I'm not 100% sure of. Rob, you can call them out if you recognize people I don't recognize. Also, I want to, there's current master students on this, and I I wanted to acknowledge them as well, that they're here. Mary, you're good to see Mary here as well. She's on maternity leave, so there's good people on the list. And shout outs to everyone for joining this conversation. In terms of the divergence, again, I was looking to reason why I was looking at the list to see if Justin was on, because he could answer the question better than me. But my understanding is that in terms of levels, Republicans think that crime is higher than Democrats. These are people that affiliate when you ask in a survey. But the trend divergence recently is that particularly sort of pre-COVID, Democrats would perceive crime was declining, which was true, and Republicans would perceive it as increasing. So in the current context where we didn't actually have a spike in crime, we had a spike in violent crime, particularly firearm crime, which Rob might be able to talk about a little bit more. In other words, we had a very specific crime problem that happened during COVID. It wasn't a generalized thing. It was particularly when we're talking about street crime rather than white collar fraud and things like that. It was violence and violence with firearms, and now that is declining. In terms of perceptions, my understanding is that if you interview a Republican or someone who identifies as Republican, they're going to think that that's not happening, that that's increasing, whereas a Democrat might, in fact, perceive it as declining. So I think, and again, I wish Justin was on the call, maybe Rob or Jason, you have a better sense of this than I. Just jump in and correct me. That right now the Republican voters are less sort of linked with reality in terms relative to Democrats.
Okay, well, I can go on to the next question. It looks like we're having quite a bit today. So we have a question here from iPad 6. He or she asks if the panelists could post some source information in the chat about those positive trends each of you were talking about, or if you just know anything off the top of your head, feel free to chime in. Yeah,
I would say the most, can you still hear me? I'm getting notes that my default microphone has changed, so I don't know which microphone I'm on at this point. But as long as you can hear me, I don't really care. Anyways, the best place to go is the Council on Criminal Justice has a series of reports that are quite well written that deal with both the trends in crime and criminal justice, incarceration, and things, as well as the changes in racial makeup. So that's the first place I'd go. If you want to look at federal system, Jason, if you want to look at sort of overall numbers in terms of the prevalence of criminal justice involvement, Jason Robey, who happens to be on the call, has a great paper that you can throw a link on, Jason, sort of really looking at that. And then his dissertation advisors had some very good papers on changes in sentencing in terms of race as well, that he might be able to point you to as well. So Jason, please promote your own work here and throw some stuff up on the chat. So those were the places I'd look. If you're interested in New York specific, there's a couple of groups out of New York City, John Jay, that have some very good New York specific reports.
All right, well, we can go on to our next question. Thank you, Dr. Bushway, for that.
Shawn, please call me Shawn, Connor.
Okay, I'll call you Shawn. Okay.
Thank you.
So Dr. Novkov has a question here. She asks, Professor Bushway, or Shawn, thank you for your remarks. I think you are right about some crime concerns being layered underneath immigration. I wonder what you think about the rhetoric about urban crime as well. There's been so much talk of how terrible/dangerous cities are, which to my ears seems to be keying, at least in part, off of race. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so there's definitely dog whistling going on, right? This is a sort of a common thing. But the disconnect is pretty striking, right? So let's talk about New York, because that's the place where we are and it's the easiest one to talk about. So in New York City, right, there used to be that the crime rates in New York City were quite high. And in terms of the population of people in our prison system, 60 some odd percent of the people, 63 to 65% of the people in New York State prisons were from New York City. Okay. That's the reason why that number is relevant, is because only 43% of the people who live in our state are from New York City. So we were overpopulated by people, we were incarcerating people in New York City largely, and it was largely due to violent crime. It wasn't just it wasn't just drug crime. And that kind of story it certainly is the case that drug crime incarcerations have been dropping, but there was a lot of violent crime in the city of New York. It's dropped dramatically. When I say dramatically, I'm not talking 10% declines. I'm talking 75% declines. I mean, big drops. And so currently in our prison system, if you look at the proportion of people are from New York City in the incarceration system of the state of New York, it's down to 37%. So people from New York City are underrepresented in the New York State incarceration or prison system. That's dramatic and shocking. The interesting thing in New York, in particular, with regard to our urban environments, is the upstate cities. And you're very lucky to have Rob on the call, because Rob deals very much with upstate cities in the way he in a lot of his work, and that's where a lot of the crime is, and it's not necessarily black crime. There's one of the things that's happening is crime rates and incarceration rates for whites are staying relatively steady or going up in some cases, particularly in the upstate counties. And so I think the conversation in New York is much less about New York City than it ever has been. And it has been more about the upstate urban cities, which have a particular name within New York. Rob will know what the name is. They're given a certain priority. And there's a lot of attention on those. And I know, Rob, are you still involved in Syracuse and Albany, or just Albany, or both?
Syracuse, yes. Albany, at least a little bit. Schenectady and some other upstate cities. And but really, you mentioned, Shawn, the increase in violent crime, especially gun crime associated with the pandemic. That was, at least across New York State, pretty uneven. And I haven't seen a compelling explanation that accounts for the cities that saw spikes in gun crime and those in which the increase was much more modest or even didn't increase at all. It is, though, from what I've seen, and certainly in the cities in which we've spent some time, it is something that predominantly affects African-American communities. I mean, overwhelmingly, the victims of gun violence are African-American. They're so much more affected by gun crime than whites in general.
All right, well, we'll go on to our next question. This one's for Professor Robey. So from Dr. Novkov again, she says, thank you for bringing federalism into the frame. In Trump's first term, we did see some pushback against federal policies from some state and local officials. She asks, do you think this is likely to happen again, possibly at a higher level, if the policies themselves are more sweeping? And do you think that the conservative court is likely to leave less latitude for state and local pushback in a second Trump term?
Yeah, those are both really great questions. I mean, I think to answer the first one, I think definitely. I mean, I think you still just see this happening today. So the two states I know the most about on this particular regard are Texas and California. So Texas formally banned sanctuary cities in the entire state of Texas. So the sanctuary city laws are not allowed in the state of Texas. On the other hand, California declared itself a sanctuary state. And so you have two very different sort of opposing views on this. Similarly, Texas currently has 26 active 287G agreements. These are agreements between local law enforcement and federal immigration to deputize local law enforcement officers to, enact immigration enforcement. And California has none of those. California has actually specifically mandated their prosecutors to consider immigration consequences of their decisions and to avoid collateral immigration consequences. Texas has essentially done the opposite. And another example of this is that California actually redefined the maximum sentence length for all state misdemeanors, specifically to avoid immigration consequences. So they redefined them from 365 days, which is a year, to 364 days, which is practically the exact same thing, but no longer triggers these sort of immigration consequences. And so there are definitely states and local jurisdictions as well that have sought to sort of decouple or increase the coupling between federal law enforcement and local and state agencies. And so I think, especially if we saw something like a plan to sort of enact a massive deportation strategy, we would certainly see differences across states, would be my guess, and how willing they are to sort of follow along with that kind of policy. And as far as the conservative court, and what I assume you're referring to the Supreme Court, that's an excellent question. To be honest, I'm not really an expert on Supreme Court decisions or how they would, fall down on this particular issue. I think it's certainly likely that they could try to decide something regarding this. In the past, with regard to secure communities, for example, generally the court has fallen on the side of sort of enhancing these agreements. So secure communities program, for people who aren't aware, the FBI routinely gets fingerprints from everybody arrested in the United States. The secure communities program started in 2008 as a pilot under the Bush administration, was made a national program under the Obama administration in 2012. Basically, they take all of the fingerprints for everyone arrested in the United States that were already going to the FBI, and they send them to the Department of Homeland Security to check for immigration status for individuals. And so the Supreme Court eventually ruled that this was a mandatory program, that jurisdictions could not opt out of this program. And so everybody arrested in the United States today is essentially checked for their immigration status against this national database. And so in the past, as far as the Supreme Court's involvement in this, they have tended to support the immigration enforcement and its connection to local law enforcement. But I don't know if Shawn or Rob have any further insights on that particular issue.
I think Dean Nobkov could answer the question better than any of us. So in terms of the political science, we're missing the political scientist. So
yeah, I wouldn't speak to what the court's likely to do. But like Shawn, I don't have the expertise to do that. Julie certainly does, but I would expect if Donald Trump were to take office and somehow tie DOJ grants to the adoption of stop and frisk strategies by state or local departments, and I'm not quite sure what the enforcement mechanism for that might look like, but I would anticipate, if he were successful, in pushback from local agencies, at least many local agencies. Notwithstanding any public perceptions, but very few agencies turned stop and frisk into an organizational strategy. Stopping people based on observed violations or on reasonable suspicion for investigation is an authority that police have exercised for decades and that has been sanctioned by the Supreme Court since the 1960s. But not many agencies treat it the way New York City did in the early aughts as an organizational strategy. And I think if a Trump administration were to try to tie the adoption of such a strategy to federal grants, that many agencies would push back against them.
Our next question is from Mary Ellen Stitt. She says, "Thank you so much for these presentations. I wondered if any of you could speak to any geographical variation and concerns about crime and criminal legal policy, and whether/how those concerns might shape Senate or House races, even if they're not as consequential at the top of the ticket."
I've been listening to some of the podcasts and things about there are, when you're talking about consequential House and Senate decisions, we're down to a few places, right? So for example, for Senate, it's in Montana. And my understanding is crime's not, and criminal justice really isn't the main set of issues there. It's And where it's interesting, I think, on the House side is the contested seats are in blue states, and the Long Island seats are examples of that, as well as there are examples in California. It sounds like Jason might know better than I on those, but and my understanding is crime does play a role in those, and some conversations about maybe that the Republicans are paying more attention to issues of crime and safety that are of relevance for suburbanites who are interacting with the cities and things like that. I don't think it's a big discussion, but it is an interesting area where essentially Republicans are able to compete for seats that have traditionally been Democratic. And they do so in part by by having an identity that's associated with crime control and safety concerns that maybe a Democrat wouldn't have. So I think it does come up there in places like New York and New York City in the environs, from what I understand, but I don't think it's playing much of a role in the Senate discussions. And the changes that's happened in the Senate are largely independent of the crime discussion. Again, no political scientist on this call, so we're having to make it up here, but hopefully that's helpful.
Well, I beg your pardon, Shawn. Actually, I am a political scientist.
Oh, I know. I thought of that after I said that. I was like, oh shit. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, I didn't really have to call you out on it.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
You can call me out on it. You are a political scientist.
We have plenty of political scientists on the call, I think. So.
All right, well, our next question is from Andrew Davies. Andrew asks, he says, I missed the first few minutes, so sorry if you addressed this. He writes that around 2018, there was ostensibly a rare moment of bipartisan unity around criminal justice reform at the federal level. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's referring to the First Steps Act here from under the Trump administration. He asks, does that bipartisan energy still exist today?
So, first of all, shout out to Andrew Davies, who's a PhD student from CJ, who is now, I believe, Andrew is still at leading an effort in Texas. Forget oh shoot, the Mustangs. I'm forgetting the name of the college. Sorry, Andrew.
Southern Methodist.
Yeah, there you go, SMU, at the law school there, particularly with respect to plea bargaining and other issues related to the courts. I think that is a concern that people have, that coalition may be breaking up. That was what I've certainly read about in preparation for this call. I have mixed feelings about how big of a deal that is, in the sense that much of the consensus really came around the mass incarceration and need to reduce incarceration. And I don't see much change in that. Where I see the change, and New York is a good example, is around the conversations about, say, bail. Andrew's a good person to ask this question, because that's probably where that is happening the most, is right around pretrial detention, where there's been pushback you saw in New York, for example. And it was originally passed with quite a bit of consensus, bipartisan, but now the Republicans have clearly taken out a position that says that, say, releasing people without bail is a position that increases crime, and put the Democrats on the defensive. And in fact, that is one of the cases. That is one of the laws that led to a flip in a House seat in New York. That's quite important. So I think there are fraying of the consensus around certain areas, particularly with respect to things like bail, but I'm not sure it's a full-blown decline in the overall consensus about let's incarcerate fewer people and find other ways. I mean, where the fraying, you could say, like, defund the police. You could maybe, and Rob, maybe we can speak to that, but that was an area where there was a split, but in some ways it wasn't the case that Republicans were arguing that we should have more police, right? So there was a consensus that maybe, keeping funding levels the same, what got, sort of where the split comes from, whether you'd be willing to, have conversations about getting rid of police altogether, which was a conversation that occurred among Democrats, but not among Republicans, right? So there are definitely places where you're not going to walk together, but around the main consensus, which was always around incarceration, I feel like that consensus is still pretty solid.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Shawn said. I think the one thing I'd also note is that I think it's in some ways might feel like there's less of a consensus or some fraying of that coalition. I think part of that is just a reduction in the amount that issue has been the focus in this particular election cycle. I think there's been a lot less focus on the issue of incarceration this particular election cycle than in previous ones, and that might be part of the reason, at least, why it seems like there's a fraying of that coalition. It's just that we aren't talking about that particular issue as much.
All right, well, related to that response, we have another question about perceptions of crime and attention it's getting in the election cycle. So Erin McElhaney, she writes that it seems like Trump is making public safety a focal point of his appeal to women voters. In a recent town hall of his with an all-women audience, he said that women would be safer under a Trump administration, particularly while pivoting away from some unpopular abortion policies. Additionally, there's been a lack of discussion about, or there has been a discussion about Harris underperforming with Black male voters who are often the main victims of disparities in the criminal justice system. So Erin asks, could this lead to more attention towards the candidate's criminal justice policies? Or do you think the conversation will largely remain under immigration?
I think I'd say the conversation, at least for the Black male voters who might be thinking about their support for Kamala Harris, is going to remain largely around the economy. And I cannot begin to speak. If Shawn's been looking at poll data, he might be able to address this, but I don't know that women are going to believe Trump when he says that they'd be safer under a Trump administration.
Okay, well, we can go on to the next question then. This is one's from
I
Renee.
wouldn't purport to have definitively answered that, Connor, but I don't see.
So first of all, shout out to Aaron, who's a student in my class, policy analysis class. So hi, Aaron. But I think, there is, for example, everyone knows that Kamala Harris had her talk last night with Fox, right? And the question is, why did she take that interview? Right. And the consensus I read is she took the interview because she wants to talk to conservative women. What did she talk about during that time? Did she talk about abortion? No, she didn't. Because she knows that's not going to be a topic for them. But she did talk a little bit about safety and those kinds of concerns. And I think she was seeing an opportunity for maybe being a little bit. I think that's a place where women are uncomfortable with Trump. So she did bring up some of the safety crime issues and her track record for paying attention to those issues. And my understanding is that if you look at her track record, she has a pretty good track record for paying attention to crimes against women. So I think there was an attempt to reach out to conservative female voters, and some of that attempt by Kamala Harris was centered on crime and criminal justice. But at this point, I think the presidential election is down to a few set of voters and a few set of places, and they're trying to figure out what the issues are that might play to them. And there may be particularly for, I totally agree with what Rob said about Black men, but for conservative women, that may be an option that could have a role, and Kamala Harris seems to be paying attention to that.
And I think just to add to that, I think particularly what I assume Trump was probably alluding to, because he sort of returned to this topic so many times, is particularly this idea of crimes committed by undocumented or other immigrant groups, right? He keeps returning to this strange story about, killing pets in this town in Ohio, and these various particularly, newsworthy examples of undocumented immigrants who have killed young women in particular. It was in Athens, Georgia, I think somewhere around the University of Georgia. There was a case, I'm forgetting the name of that woman, but that was a very big talking point for Trump and for other Republicans around that time, and remains so today. So I think to a large part, this discussion of public safety by Trump and other Republicans is, I think, largely connected to this idea that the Biden administration and Harris, by extension, have been sort of letting in a large number of undocumented immigrants who are out there committing crimes, which, as Shawn alluded to earlier, we know from the evidence, some of which, is part of my research and the research of some of my colleagues, that this is just simply not true. Immigrant populations generally have much lower crime rates, or about equal crime rates, depending how you look at it. But in general, I think, to me, that's what they're sort of whistling to on the conservative side when they're talking about issues of public safety. I think is still coming back to this issue of crime among immigrant groups in particular.
All right, thanks. So Renee has a question somewhat related to the responses you've all just given here. She writes that both candidates seem to brag that they are tough on crime or criminals. And she asks, to what extent do you think this is just rhetoric to get votes versus positions that could actually turn into changes to criminal justice policy? And would these changes be positive or negative in your view?
Personally, I think that given the limitations on the federal role in state and local law enforcement, that how tough criminal justice becomes is largely determined by states and localities, and not by whoever occupies the Oval Office. So regardless of the election outcome, I don't foresee things getting appreciably tougher in the next 4 years, in the sense of vigorous police enforcement, in terms of arrests, in terms of prosecutions and convictions, and Shawn's already spoken to incarceration. So I guess that means it's rhetoric. Not many people are for crime, so to that extent, it makes sense to stake out a position that that you would take steps to keep people safe, which has been true for many, many years.
I mean, I think going back to, Clinton, right? Clinton made a conscious decision that he wasn't going to get beaten on tough on crime, right? So the 1994 crime bill, which was one of the largest single increases in federal support for local law enforcement, 10,000 cops, I think is, from that point on, the Democrats have been particularly concerned about not, getting beat on the tough on crime issue, which is one of the things that makes the whole defund the police thing so interesting, because that was like a slip up. Like they had spent so much time to make sure that they were affiliated with with cops, and they weren't going to, and in some cases you'd see, New York City is an interesting example with de Blasio and the tension between the cops and de Blasio. But in many cases, the police union, which is a very strong political force in a lot of local environments, have been aligned with the Democrats on some cases. And so the Democrats have been very careful, and the defund the police was just was a clear misstep. And you could see it. The Republicans saw it the minute it happened. It's like, oh, we're going to be able to resurrect this issue. So I think in general, it is rhetoric to try to protect the turf. I also think that it's hard to, it's important not to overstate the role of policy in some of the changes I was describing, right? Crime waves happen for lots of reasons, a lot of which have nothing to do with policy per se. And so the issue, I think, is whether there will be room for manipulation on the margin. It's hard to see how, it looks to me like whatever government we end up with at the federal level is going to be split. So there isn't going to be any sweeping policy changes that of the kind that we saw in the crime bill coming out of no matter who wins. And I think that, so it's unlikely to see that it's going to be that there will be an opportunity for much change here. Changes on the margin, like the ones that were described. Maybe, Kamala Harris will rescind we'll go back to the Obama era. We'll maintain the getting rid of private prisons that Biden, so we had Obama, got rid of private prisons, Trump put them back in, Biden, so there's a little bit of changes there that are executive orders, but for the most part, I don't see big changes happening in either case that are motivated by that. And maybe the biggest place is in the operation of the Justice Department and how aggressively the Justice Department tries to enforce rules against police departments and things like that. I thought the earlier discussion sort of highlighted that, right? And so to the extent to which the current Trump did not enforce those things at all, and current administration will. So I think those are really where it is. Rather than in any kind of big sweeping policy change. There's no omnibus bill coming down the pike, I don't think.
One other thing I'll note relatively quickly is a paper I haven't published, but should have published probably a long time ago, on the role of presidents in affecting the federal judiciary. So when they appoint judges to the federal district courts, each president typically pretty markedly shifts the proportion of judges within the federal judiciary who are appointed by a Democrat or Republican up to 8-10 points in a typical presidency. And Republican and democratically appointed judges also sentence very differently. So Republican judges tend to sentence people to longer terms of incarceration and are more likely to sentence them to incarceration. So that is one area where we might see some differences, just because we tend to see that difference every time. In that they will appoint judges to the federal district courts who tend to sentence slightly differently, whether they're appointed by a Democrat or Republican.
All right, well, it looks like we have an observation here, but feel free for any of the panelists to respond to this from either Therese or Teresi. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly. She writes that living here in Trumpland in the Villages, Florida, it seems to me like one of the most problematic things of Trumpism is the total disregard of objective facts or data. If data supports a Trump position, then it is the truth. If not, then contrary facts or data are deemed fake news. It is truly a cult phenomenon, she writes. If there are any reactions, feel free.
The first reaction is that it's always been the case, I think, that facts are not the predominant discussion point in discussions about crime. It's one of the frustrating parts about being involved in the criminal justice system. Everybody has an opinion, and it's rarely based on facts, right? So we got these phenomenons that have always been true. Like everybody thinks their neighborhood's getting safer, but crime is going up. Like, okay, that can't be true, right? And so there's a general disconnect that always happens. And like I said, it started out with the reason why I decided to bring it up is this conversation about crime and criminal justice, right? There's been an 85% reduction in arrests for violent crime among youth in this country under the age of 18. Did you know that? Does anyone know that? The changes in racial disparity are dramatic. If I had stood up in 2000 and said, okay, by 2024, we're going to reduce the prison population by 30%. The racial disparity is going to drop in half. You would have all said, and you would have all said, great. First of all, you're nuts. That can't happen. Second thing you'd say is, well, have a huge party when that happens. Well, guess what? It happened. Where's the party? Right. And so, and there's good reasons why both Democrats and Republicans don't want to have this conversation and don't want to talk about this. And so that is the problem, right? There is not a lot of incentives for sort of talking about the truth. I mean, if you're an advocacy group who's been focused on reducing the juvenile justice population, which is a very big movement over the last 15 years, you've been wildly successful. the population of people in juvenile detention facilities is, last time I checked, 75% less. I mean, there's just empty juvenile justice facilities, which is great. And yet, when you talk to advocates, it's as if we're at the same levels we were before. And if you say to them, why are you doing that? Well, because I think the answer should be zero. I don't think we're ever going to have a point where we're not going to incarcerate juvenile justice people who are under the age of 18 in juvenile justice facilities. I don't think that's possible. I haven't seen a society where that happens. But they say, well, if we start to acknowledge success, then we lose our momentum, all that kind of thing. But the reality is, it's been wildly successful, and we're not talking about it. So I think it's a general phenomenon. I also think both parties have an incentive not to acknowledge progress because it eliminates their talking points. But it is a general, one of the biggest frustrations I have working in this field is a big disconnect.
One other point I'll add to that Shawn is probably aware of, that I think is frustrating to me in these discussions about how we continue to reform, particularly imprisonment and incarceration in this country, is it's often focused on nonviolent offenders and drug offenders. If you look at the state prisons in the United States, only about 12% of state prisoners are there for drug offenses. More than 60% are there for violent offenses. Nearly a third are there for a sexual assault or a murder. So in general, when we're talking about, how not only whether or not we've reduced imprisonment in recent decades, but also how we continue to do that, the discussion's often focused on sort of the easiest targets, right? Nonviolent offenders, drug offenders, property offenders, but they make up a relatively small proportion of who's left in prison in 2024, and so I think that's, like Shawn said, I think there's hesitancy on both sides to recognize, some of the empirical realities at play here.
Okay, so we'll try to squeeze in one last question here before we let all of you go. So this is one from Dr. Novkov. She writes, primarily for Professor Worden, do you think there's political room for a robust conversation about qualified immunity now, if not perhaps in the near future? And if you were advising an advocacy group about this, would you tell them to try to initiate or strengthen the conversation nationally or more locally?
Interesting question. Unless a blue wave washes over Congress next month, I don't foresee a robust discussion about qualified immunity at the national level. And honestly, I don't know what authority states or certainly localities would have to deviate from federal case law. Though not knowing case law nearly as well as you know it, I could be completely wrong. But if I were advising an advocacy group, I don't think I'd point them at the state or local level, unless I pointed them to localities and when they collectively bargain. That the terms of collective bargaining agreements might offer more leverage in terms of deterring police misconduct through the use of threats of punishment.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our panelists today. A super informative and fun discussion, and thank you so much for answering all of our questions. So the Rockefeller College Election Series is going to kick it into high gear as we reach the final 2 weeks or so of the political campaign. So next week we're going to have two talks. One of them is going to continue our discussion of policy. We're going to have one panelist on foreign policy, one on education policy, and one on climate policy. That's on Monday, same time, 12 to 1 on Zoom. And then on Wednesday, we're going to have a talk on civil disobedience. Again, same time, 12 to 1 on Zoom. But once again, thank you so much, everyone.